Now, Rococo, which is the light, airy, Baroque style of the 18th century, well, it eventually gives way to Neoclassicism. And Neoclassicism is a late 18th, early 19th century art movement. It's based on the revival of classical antiquity, based on classical sculpture and architecture, and on high Renaissance painting. It is, of course, during the 18th century when they discovered Pompeii and Herculaneum, the cities the cities that were covered by volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius. And one of the interesting things about that is that some of the paintings, of course, are very soft-edged, but people really didn't know that, because unless you were, digging it up, the images that would come back to Europe would be line drawings. And so for a long time, Neoclassicism, felt that classical art should be very, very hard-edged. However, there are some exceptions in which there's a little softer version of Neoclassicism, which we're going to see with Angelica Kauffman. Angelica Kauffman is born in Switzerland. She's raised in Austria and Italy. She goes to England for about 16 years. She returns to Italy. Basically, she has a long and a successful career as a history painter. And we're going to talk about what a history painter is, because it is very unusual at this time for a woman to be a history painter. As we said, she's born in Switzerland. She's raised in Austria. She seems to be a child prodigy as far as her artwork is concerned, because here we have a self-portrait of herself at age 13, and already very accomplished. Some of you may know that Albrecht Dürer has a silver point drawing of himself at age 13. There's a Bernini statue that is Bernini at age 13. So there's a certain number of artists who really are producing work that one would expect from someone who was much older. She was trained by her father. Her father was an artist, not nearly as successful as she will become, but that was her first person that trained her, Johann Joseph Kauffman. And she traveled with him in Austria and in Italy. And essentially that's how she gets her training. She studies the art because they go to different museums and galleries and meet people that have art collections. And she really has a continental artistic experience. She looks at ancient and Roman art. She meets the neoclassical artists in Rome. They live in Italy for a while. She later returns to Italy. They live in England. I should mention that one thing about her father doesn't just train her and then she goes off on her own. A woman couldn't do that. So her father travels with her, and he essentially serves as chaperone. Which is, a way of ensuring to sort of prove her propriety, which is one of the things that women artists and any woman who was in, the eye of the public would really have to emphasize. She's elected to the Academy of St. Luke in Rome, and then she goes to London, where she becomes a very close friend to Joshua Reynolds. And we see here with this self-portrait in which she's holding her drawing pad, three-quarter view, in fairly loose garments, which are probably fashionable, but they do remind you of classicizing garments, as we'll see. And here's another picture of her. She is one of the founding members of the British Royal Academy. We're going to have to talk about that a little bit. And she helps introduce neoclassicism to Britain. This was something that Joshua Reynolds was very, very instrumental in introducing neoclassicism to Britain. I think it's Wendy Roworth, who wrote a book on Angelica Kauffman, and she says that Kauffman actually had better training than Reynolds because she spent all that time, in Europe, and that she was the embodiment. It's been said that she is the embodiment of neoclassicism in Britain, and she certainly does help introduce that. Here we're seeing here a self-portrait with a bust of Minerva. And so that, in a sense, there's the correlation being made with the goddess of wisdom, the goddess who presided over the arts and crafts, and who is a female, virginal, classical deity. So she's taking on Minerva, as so many learned women did, taking on Minerva as a kind of emblem, in a sense. Now, I wanted to mention a little bit about the British Royal Academy. Now, France had an academy, and of course, Rome had had one for a long time. When the British Royal Academy was founded, there were 40 original members, 40 founding members, of which there were only 2 female members. And these 2 remained the only members of the Royal Academy in Britain until the 20th century, and I've read 2 dates for the 20th century woman. One was like 1920, and another was 1936. So I'm not quite certain when they finally started letting women into the Royal Academy. Angelica Kauffman was one, who was one of the original members. Maria Mosher was the wife of one of the members, and I'm not going to really talk much about her. I think she does still lifes, and she had a celebrated affair with an artist. But at any rate, those are the only 2 women who were allowed in the Royal Academy. They just would not elect any other women. This is a picture, as you can see, of the academicians of the Royal Academy. It was painted in 1771 and 2. And it's showing the academicians in a room filled with classical and Renaissance sculpture with a nude model, who you can see seated over on the right, your right, as you're looking at it. But the women, where are they? Well, it wouldn't be proper for a woman artist to be in the same room with a nude model, and certainly even less proper for to be there with all the other men and a nude figure. So the women are represented as pictures on the wall. So they are right up there on the, as we face at the left side, excuse me, as we face at the right side, and you can see a portrait of Kauffman and Mosher. One of the things about this, of course, is it turns the women from being the creators of art and being active figures into objects of art, the static objects. So they're included, but it's like, okay, they're women, they're subsidiary. This is Angelica Kauffman's portrait of her friend Joshua Reynolds. He was her friend. He was you could even call him her mentor in England. She was already an accomplished painter. Joshua Reynolds was particularly known for his portrait painting, and he was very keen to introduce neoclassicism into England. He was the first president of the British Royal Academy, one of the founders. And let's see how Kauffman represents him in his study. With the bust of Michelangelo behind him. We'll be talking about that. And I also brought up a picture of the still life to show you that Kauffman does a beautiful job of that as well. So showing him sort of like pausing in the middle of his study. And there is the idea, of course, of the artist here as intellectual as well as the artist as a skilled craftsperson. It's kind of interesting to look at the difference, how Joshua Reynolds portrays himself and how Kauffman portrays him. Reynolds has his hand on his hip with this gesture of command that goes back to Holbein's pictures of Henry VIII. I'm not sure whether that's intended, but certainly the gesture has been around for a while. And he looks like a very commanding presence with the bust of Michelangelo behind him. He's being, likening himself to the great Renaissance artist. Kauffman's picture is much more informal. I mean, this is a painting of a friend showing her friend as an intellectual at study. And once again, the bust of Michelangelo, which must have been a prized possession. The bust of Michelangelo is in the shadows, in the background, but making the likeness between the great Renaissance artist and the great neoclassical artist. And as we said, Kauffman chooses not the bust of Michelangelo for her self-portrait, but a bust of Minerva. Minerva, or Athena, is the goddess of wisdom, Athena in Greek, Minerva in Latin. And so what essentially she's doing is showing herself as a woman of art and learning, and likening herself essentially to the classical deity who is the patron of art and learning, rather than using the bust of a male artist, where the connection certainly wouldn't be as clear. Now, her personal life was not always wonderful. While she was in England, she met this supposedly Swedish count, and he was in all the fashionable circuits. He fooled everybody. He didn't just fool her. It turned out he was a con man. He was not a count, and she found out too late. She had married him. And they had the marriage annulled. Essentially, she gave him money to go away. He, was a dishonest person. He was not what he seemed to be. And there is even the possibility that he may have fraudulently married women for their money previously. I think it speaks to Kauffman's probity, to her virtue, if you will, to her moral probity, that she does not marry again until after her husband, can we call him her former husband, has died before she's willing to marry again. And she is Catholic. It's like she's not going to take any chances again. Probably, as I said, the marriage was annulled. It was not a divorce. It was a marriage under false pretenses. And the man may not have even been free to marry. So by all legal and moral criteria, she could have married again because it wasn't a valid marriage. But she chooses not to marry until after the person that she gave vows to, whether under false, and she was being tricked or not. So in 1781, she marries a Venetian painter, Antonio Zucchi, who becomes her business manager. And she continues, of course, to be the famous artist. She returns to Venice. Then she goes to Rome. Returns to Venice. I think her father dies then, and then they go to Rome. And she has this wonderful reputation as a renowned artist. She earns a lot of money. She's very, very wealthy, and she knows the people in the artistic circles. There's Goethe, for example. Says that he dined with Angelica Kauffman in Rome every Sunday, and he went and looked at Renaissance paintings with her. And he says, she has a trained eye and knows a great deal about the technical side of painting. Moreover, she is sensitive to all that is true and beautiful, and incredibly modest. He says that for a woman, she has extraordinary talent. And you will be hearing throughout history these backhanded compliments, or left-handed compliments, however you want to refer to them. They are intended to be very complimentary to the women artists, but they're always saying, wow, it's incredible. She's a woman and she can actually do something. The other leitmotif that you'll hear is the comparison of a woman to a man. Is you couldn't believe that it's a woman painting rather than a man, and that's, once again, is supposed to be a compliment. But the assumption is that somehow this is a aberration, that women just can't be as good as men. So if she's successful, she's unique. We see a lot of unique women throughout history. And I wanted to show you this self-portrait between music and painting. Now, it's a kind of allegorical self-portrait. And I must admit, if you think about the date, she's born in 1741, so she must be about 50 when this is being painted in 1791. But she shows herself as a young, beautiful woman. Obviously, she was a young, beautiful, she's supposed to have been very vivacious, and she's supposed to have made friends very, very easily. So she's supposed to be this young, vivacious woman. And of course, in a sense, it does make some sense, because what we're seeing is a painting of an initial choice that she had to make in her career. So even if she's painting it when she's 50, this is the choice of her life, as it were. She evidently was quite accomplished in music, as many women were expected to be, as well as in painting. And she's choosing a career, which was not something that most women had a choice in. But she's, obviously her father encouraged her, and that makes all the difference. So she's being torn between the allegorical figure of music and the red dress with the musical score written in her lap, and painting. And painting, of course, is the woman in blue and gold and holding a palette while she's pointing upward. It looks like she's pointing up to the top of a mountain. Now, this is as I say, it's an allegory of choice, of her having to decide which way her career will go. The source of this type of picture, where you're choosing between two personifications, goes back to a classical theme. Hercules at the Crossroads, in which Hercules has to decide between virtue and vice, between a life of honor and hardship or a life of luxury and pleasure. And one of the most famous paintings, I guess, of this is the painting of Annibale Carracci, Baroque painting somewhere around 1600. Hercules at the Crossroads. And as you can see, virtue is pointing upwards to the high and rocky road of virtue. Scale the heights, as it were. And Hercules is sort of sitting between them. He's not really giving an indication which way he's going, actually. Pleasure, or vice, or voluptas, is shown as a somewhat nude woman, nude with a transparent drapery. And beside her there are attributes, little objects that suggest there's a mask, which could be, we could think of a theater mask, but it could also be a mask of deceit. So there's little attributes there that's suggesting that her way may be pleasurable and easy, but it's not the right way to go. So here we see Kauffman and Carracci's version of this choice between two personifications. You'll notice that Kauffman has shown painting as pointing upward. Well, is that the high and rocky road? I think virtue sometimes is very, very, very difficult. Well, it would be for her to achieve things, but essentially painting is saying, that you will achieve the pinnacle of fame. And it may be a difficult upward struggle, but you can do it. Of course, by this time she's already done it, so she knows which way it's going to work out. Kauffman turns almost regretfully to music. She's sort of squeezing her hand, but she's gesturing and turning in the way that she's going to go, the way of painting. Now, you'll notice we talked about some mythological themes. We've talked about allegories, and that's what history painting is. I said that she's a female history painter, which is very unusual. History painting could be history. It could be mythology, it could be allegorical, it could be religious subjects. And these were considered in the 18th and part of the 19th century to be the most important subjects for art. They were considered to be lofty. They were considered that they would have some kind of moral lesson. They would be uplifting to the viewer. The themes were usually narrative. I mean, you could have something like a Madonna and Child, which is not necessarily a narrative, although we know the stories behind it. But they were supposed to, make you better, essentially. All history paintings have as their main forms the human figure, because who is doing this history, but the human beings. Now, generally, women artists were not supposed to be history painters. One of the main things that history painters had to do was paint nude or nearly nude classical figures. If you're showing the Greek gods, you can't have them dressed from ankle to neck. And to be a great history painting, you had to know anatomy. Now, women were forbidden to study the nude. And you'll think back to your Linda Nochlund's article about why were there no great women artists. Well, maybe there were some, but it was very difficult because for centuries, really from the, certainly from the 16th century, for the 15th century actually, through the 19th century, our painters were judged on how well they knew anatomy, how well they could paint anatomy and study the nude. And women were forbidden to study the nude. In fact, that prohibition stayed until artists were no longer judged by how well they did the nude. So in the 20th century, when abstraction comes in, well, it seems like it's now all right to let them study the nude, at least in certain cases. So how did she manage? We see this little engraving here, little print of her studying and drawing a torso. She learned anatomy from classical statues, Renaissance paintings, and draped models. And of course, always very carefully covered in the strategic places. And you'll find that that is also true of her classical forms. There's really no genitalia showing, which would be totally horrifying if a woman artist were to do that. So all of her figures are strategically draped, as we might say. Now, one thing that most artists did to both prove their skill and to train themselves, and also because they would get commissions for copies, was to copy other artists. So here we see a copy of Angelica Kauffman, the larger image, after the Cumean Sibyl of Domenichino, who is a 17th century Baroque artist, one of the classical Baroque artists of Italy. It's in the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and I will tell you that my picture is a bit dark, because of course I'm taking it with film, and but there's some details. And we often see in her work classical female themes, not exclusively, certainly, many, many male themes as well. One of the interesting things, that this is a familiar subject, but some of the subjects she uses are not always the most famous subjects. So she obviously had a good classical education. This one is Penelope. Penelope at her loom. And Penelope, of course, is the wife of Odysseus, or Ulysses, who went off to fight the Trojan War and took 20 years to come home. During that period, she was much besieged. Besieged is probably a good word. Beset, besieged, betwixt between suitors who wanted to marry her and she wanted to remain faithful to her husband, whose fate she did not know. Now, she made a bargain with the suitors that she was weaving a tapestry, and when she'd finished weaving this, then she would make her decision of who she would marry. And so every day she wove and wove and wove, and every night she tore out whatever she had whatever she had done that day, so that she never had to make the decision. She is the epitome of the faithful wife, and you can see at her feet the bow and the dog of Ulysses or Odysseus. They both feature very strongly in the story, because when Odysseus does return, and nobody recognizes him, he's been gone for 20 years, except his very, very old dog who knew him when he was a puppy. And the dog greets him, and Odysseus, who's trying to come in incognito, it's horrible. He has to ignore the dog, and the dog dies. And there is that element of the faithful wife, the faithful dog, and it just seems so tragic. That the dog, who has stayed alive to recognize his master, doesn't even get the acknowledgement. The other attribute, the bow of Odysseus. Odysseus was supposed to be so strong that he could pull this, shoot an arrow with this bow that nobody else could pull, and so. He slays all the suitors with his bow. So this is a classical female of great fidelity and propriety. There's a moral lesson therein of what a woman should be.